Hey, it's Thomas Mulready from coolcleveland.com. We are here today with Clinton Heylin. I'm so excited, Clinton. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, delighted.
You are the author of this new book, The Double Life of Bob Dylan, A Restless, Hungry Feeling. It's the first half of Bob Dylan's life, 1941 when he was born to 1966, published by Little Brown. And it's part of a planned two-part series, right? You're going to follow up with this and complete his life with a second volume.
Yeah, I mean, so needless to say, the second volume's going to be bigger. As I jokingly say, the first volume covers 5 years of his creative life, and the second volume covers 55.
Right, and going and still running
and still going. Yeah.
You are legendary, Clinton. I'm so happy to finally meet you because of this book here in Cleveland, From the Velvets to the Voidoids, which came out in the early 90s, right? I mean, and you were
my
here.
Second book. Yeah. 1992. Yeah. I mean,
it's brilliant. The way that you cover the pre-punk sort of fomenting of the punk movement in 3 cities, New York and London, of course, but Cleveland. You really focus on bands like Rocket from the Tombs, Pere Ubu, Cinderella Backstreet, Peter Lochner, of course, Mirrors, Electric Eels, Dead Boys, eventually Devo. And you really nailed it. I have to say, you, of anyone, figured out how to contextualize what was going on in music here in Cleveland during that time period. And you live in, where are you, in Somerset? Is that where you are in England?
Yeah. But I'm from Manchester. So,
right.
I mean, one of the things that inspired me to write that book was because of this symbiotic relationship between Manchester punk and Cleveland punk. As Manchester was to London, obviously we had the Buzzcocks, we had Joy Division, we had, Cleveland has the equivalent of every one of our bands. They have an equivalent. And I often tell the story about, when Pere Ubu came to England, their very first concert was in Manchester at Rafters, and the support bands were the Pop Group and a local band called the Negatives, who included Paul Morley, the rock critic, Kevin Cummins, the photographer, Richard Boone, the Buzzcocks manager. They were the opening act, and I was stood next to Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner's from Joy Division. So,
wow.
There's a whole kind of connection there. And ditto for Devo. Their first ever English gig was in Manchester, supporting Albertus y los Trios Paranoias. The leader of whom was a guy called C.P. Lee, sadly recently passed away, who did, of course, write 2 books on Bob Dylan.
And I see you've got the Rocket from the Tombs poster there, which is so cool. that's very Cleveland.
Signed by David, I hasten to add, after the show. Yeah. Yeah. And just quickly to say, when it happened, somebody phoned me up from the New York Times here and said, "I'd like to interview you about Rocket from the Tombs." And I went, "What?" And he said, "Well, they're playing New York." And I went, "But Peter's dead." "What do you mean they're playing New York?" And he said, "Well, they're doing a small tour. Richard Lloyd has replaced Peter in the band." I went, "Wow, this I've got to see." And so the guy interviewed me for the New York Times about, obviously, the original Rocket from the Tombs, but I didn't know anything about it. And it just so happened that I was going to be in New York anyway. I'd already booked my flight. And I was like, I'm going to be there. I said, I got to go. But yeah, what a great show. What a great show. But it's so great to see them. Yeah.
Wow. So you have, not only are you writing on punk, books on the Sex Pistols, for example, you've got a book on the Beatles, right?
Yep.
Bruce Springsteen, more punk.
Yep.
Love this book, by the way.
Oh.
You see how many times I've marked this, all the Mad Men, Sid Barrett, David Bowie, Nick Drake, Pink Floyd, the Kinks, the Who. Fabulous book, but you don't stop there. You've got a book on Orson Welles.
My God, you really have got the nerve.
I don't have all of them, but I'm looking forward to this one as well, and the one on the music industry, because we both have sort of a fascination for these sort of
Totally.
movers and players and managers. But boy, oh boy, how many books, Clinton, have you written?
I think it's 28. Yeah, but I don't hold me to that. You know.
And how many on Bob Dylan? Because I've got 6.
Yeah,
Just on Dylan
I
alone.
think it's 9. You know, I mean, I don't, you know, I don't. I mean, there was a thing in the, believe it or not, in the Guardian, the national newspaper, earlier this week, and somebody was putting me down for having written, they claimed, 13 books on Bob Dylan, as if that was some kind of put down. You know, I'm like, I mean, nobody ever makes that attack. Nobody attacks Harold Bloom for writing 47 books on Shakespeare. I don't get it. I don't, you know. But as I say, in fact, in the introduction to the new book, I make the comment that Dylan fans who do their job are called obsessives, and Shakespeare fans who do their job are called scholars. You know, I mean, I've written on both. You know, I wrote a book on Shakespeare as well, so you know, I think I can actually see it from both points of view. And I'm sorry, what I do is scholarship. You know.
And you are a scholar. You're a Dylan scholar, and I love the sort of overarching theme you've got here of the double life of Bob Dylan. I want to just start with that because he obviously has more than 2 lives. He seems to reinvent himself constantly. He's got so many names for himself, starting with Robert Zimmerman. He's got his Jewish name. He was known as Elston Gunn, I think, when he was backing up Bobby V. Blind Boy Grunt. He goes by Bob Landy. Robert Milkwood Thomas, Lucky Wilbury, of course, with the Traveling Wilburys, Boo Wilbury, Jack Frost. He has so many sides. Who said this? That he's round. I mean,
yeah, well, in fact, yeah. I mean, Bernard Patcherell said that, and I mean, the thing is, you know, the double life. It is meant to be that kind of double-edged sword thing. You know, it's the Gemini nature. Of course, he is a Gemini. It's hot and cold, warm and, you know, frosty. It's that whole thing of being public, being private, being an artist, being a person, being, you know, it's a whole series of dualities, because, you know, we are all dualities, but Dylan is a particularly extreme example. And a degree. I mean, let's not forget, you mentioned about me writing the book All the Madmen, which deals with madness as a theme in rock music. You know, there is a little bit of schizophrenia in Bob. You know, there's definitely, you know, you're not always sure which Bob Dylan you're going to meet. You know, people are always asking me if I ever met him. I'm like, why would I want to meet him? He's never going to be himself. He's never gonna sit down and have a beer with me and talk about the football, is he? You know?
no, he says, I think it's in one of the outtakes from Eat the Document that you dug up because you had access to these archives. He says, nobody who's looking at me now has got any idea who they're seeing, and yet they have the gall to think it's me.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Did that speak to you personally?
Totally. And the amazing thing about that little clip that you just said, and you quoted it exactly right, is that he actually records that at the end of the tour, and it's clearly meant to be the end of the film. It's the very last thing they film, and he's talking straight to the camera when he says that. And it's like a message to us all. And then, of course, you know, 6 weeks later, he falls off his bike and it all goes. You know?
And the second half of his life begins, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Or in fact, the born again Bob begins, because the Dylan that fell off his bike is, you know, it's a Paul is dead moment. You know, that guy never comes back. You know, come back, but you can't come back all the way. You know,
that's exactly right. You actually spent 10 weeks. 9 to 5, full days, full weeks at the new archives in Tulsa at the Gilcrease Museum that Bob Dylan sold his archives for something like $22 million, which I guess that's a thing now. I used to donate your papers to a library, but now they pay you millions.
Yeah.
and there's so much there that you dug up. You had access to so much, and a lot of it, as you say, is going to come out in the second book, because that's kind of just where those archives were. What was one of the most surprising things that you found? First, I want to know, when you walked through the door there, what was that feeling like when you finally saw? You must have just lost your mind.
Well, I mean, it really is an amazing moment. I don't know if people really who don't do kind of archival research on that level really understand just how exciting it is to go in and look. And I don't just mean Dylan. I mean, you know, I've been to the Berg collection in New York Public Library and looked at P.G. Wodehouse manuscripts. It's just as exciting. You know, it's just, I mean, just the idea that you're looking at something that is, you know, touched by that person, and that there's one copy of it in the world. And obviously, I mean, to have the privilege to handle all three of the Blood on the Tracks notebooks. I mean, the two that are in Tulsa and the one that's at the Morgan Library, which the previous owner allowed me to inspect many years ago. But you know, to handle those kind of things, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, I've written in my book on Shakespeare, actually, that you know, these are Dylan's sonnets. These are, you know, these Blood on the Tracks lyrics to me are as important as love poems. I mean, as Shakespeare's sonnets. So you know, to be able to see the moment of creation, you know, it's an extraordinary thing.
And then, as you spent these 10 weeks there, what was your first big aha moment? I mean, for you, you're so in the weeds on every detail. You've read all the books, you've written all the books, you've looked at all the bootlegs, you've studied all the outtakes. But there must have been something when you were going through these archives, and you were one of the very few who were allowed in. You can't just walk in off the street. You have to apply and get accepted. Was there a aha moment when you found something that you just said, whoa, holy shit, look at this? I mean,
oh, every day, every single day. I would, and Mark Davidson, who's the chief librarian there, is a wonderfully helpful guy and extremely knowledgeable on all forms of music. I mean, what we've been talking about interests him as much as Dylan. You know, I'd be looking at something and I would go, Mark, come here. Do you realize what this is? You know, and of course, you know, he's a knowledgeable guy, but he wouldn't understand. You know, if I'm showing him a piece of paper and Dylan's writing about why do people want the old songs, you know, to him, it's just Dylan having a little rant about people asking for the old songs. And I'm going, this is May the 15th, 1980. He's in the Pittsburgh Hilton when he wrote this. He's about to give an interview on the TV. He's about to go on stage and tell people, why do you keep asking for the old songs? He's thinking it all out and he's writing it down and he's expressing this, you know, why do people keep asking me? You know, and you're looking and just going, wow, this survived. I mean, what's amazing is that the whole conception of Dylan as somebody who writes in the moment and then throws the paper in the bin goes out the window. It just goes out the window. It turns out he was a hoarder. It turns out there are scraps of paper that are, you know, those little notepads you get in your hotel room, you know, and you know, there's the second volume of the, you know, is actually called Far Away From Myself, which is from the line in Things Have Changed that he won the Oscar for. I'm trying to get as far away from myself as I can.
I had a question about that because, again, you are trying to get close. You're trying to bring people close to Bob Dylan. And he specifically says in that song, which is one of his big songs, right?
Totally.
Is that the one? Did he win the Academy Award for that one? Or
won the Oscar for it? Yeah.
The Oscar, right. He says, I'm trying to get as far away, not just holding people off here, okay?
Yeah.
And also not, I don't want to keep you away. I'm trying to get as far away from myself.
Yeah. No, it's a hugely important line. So in Tulsa, there's a business card for a boxing gym. On the back of the card is that one line. So it's not the song, it's just that line. But you can tell when you listen to the song and you know that, you go, that's the trigger. That's where the song comes from. That's what he's trying to say. And it's just that line. And
not just that song. That's, to me, sums up what you're trying to get at. When you say, I'm looking at the life of Bob Dylan, and he says, I'm trying to get as far away. You know, he's not on the same path as you. Let's put it that way. He's running this.
As I make very clear in the first volume, the very important point, which is that he wrote a work of literature called Chronicles. What he did not write is a work of biography or memoir. It is a complete, it's what I call a liar's autobiography, after the great Graham Chapman.
And you had access to all the rough drafts of that finally.
No, I saw some of them, only a few. I mean, but enough to get a picture and enough to get a sense that this is a very deliberate, cultivated act on his part. And that's he's entitled. He's perfectly entitled to do that. One of the little threads that's in my book is this idea that Dylan knows this, and he leaves you little clues. He always tells you, I'm pulling your chain here. He never just lies. You know, there's always something that says you shouldn't believe everything I say.
There's a little wink and a nod with it always. Yeah.
And there's a great bit in the book that I quote a Los Angeles journalist in '66 called Earl Leaf, quite a well-known celebrity in his own right in those days, is sitting with Dylan at the Whiskey a Go-Go the night of Otis Redding. No, not of Otis Redding, of the Byrds. And they're talking. And he's talking about the reception Dylan got at the LA press conference. And it's a really, really hostile interrogation by some very ignorant people. And Dylan really has a go. And Earl Leaf says, that was pretty amazing the way that you handled that. And Dylan says to him, if I told you 10 lines, would you know the one that was true? You know, and Earl says, yeah, I would know. He said, well, they didn't. and that's it. And that's the point that you need to understand at all times. It's not a simple truth fiction. It's not, you know, if Dylan was an historian, he'd be a lousy historian. If I was a songwriter, I'd be a lousy songwriter, you know.
Right. He doesn't suffer fools. Let's put it that way. He expects you to meet him where he's at. He expects some work by the media who are asking him questions, by his audiences who really took a while to catch up to him, and maybe a lot of them still haven't caught up to him or forgiven him. But you have to work in order to be a Bob Dylan fan, or even to understand his music.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah. I mean, it's definitely not. It's not easy listening. It's not. You know, you are meant to work at the songs, and nothing that he ever does do you get it all in one listen. You know, if you hear a song and you've taken it all in one listen, then it's not for the ages. You know, that song will be forgotten. You know, and Dylan realized that pretty early on. And obviously the songs that are covered in the first volume are the songs that are perhaps his most famous songs. You know, the Blowing in the Winds, The Times Are Changing, The Tambourine Man, The Like a Rolling Stone, The Visions of Johanna. But what's fascinating is the self-awareness. You know, it's clear from all the stuff that he's left behind that this was no accident. You know, things didn't just happen. Dylan worked at becoming Bob Dylan.
So let's walk through how he became Bob Dylan, because he didn't start out that way. And your book starts really with this cool set of sort of flashbacks back and forth between him hitting New York and becoming Bob Dylan, and his early years in Hibbing and Duluth. And when he was in high school, really, he started with rock and roll, correct? I mean, with this band, the Golden Chords. And he said in his yearbook, he wanted to join Little Richard. Same thing David Bowie said, basically, almost to the word.
Well,
so,
I mean, certainly in the new volume, Louis Kemp, who was a childhood friend, talks about Dylan at camp. And he used to go to this Jewish camp in Wisconsin every summer. And Louis and Larry Keegan, who's a key figure in those early years, who tragically had a very bad accident, their connection with Dylan, and they're 13 or 14 at this point, is music. And this is pre-rock and roll. This is Hank Williams. This is, Johnny Ace, maybe. It's proto rock and roll. But you follow that through all the way, you realize that Dylan's relationships with his contemporaries is music driven. Girlfriends, boyfriends, anything, it's always music driven. And as you say, I mean, I do this thing where I shuttle backwards and forwards a little, simply because I want to break the story up. And I want to go through that Bob Dylan was born on the 24th of May. It's just a bit cliched. And I thought, I'll have a little fun with this. So I start with him arriving in New York. And then he goes back to Minneapolis to show everyone he's made it. And then I kind of rewind to the early days in Minneapolis. So, it's just hopefully to keep the reader engaged.
It does that. And it's very cinematic, I think, with the flashbacks, in my opinion. You can sort of see you're into him here, and then all of a sudden it flashes back to, and it always connects at a point where it relates. You get up to the point where he starts to talk about rock and roll, and then you flip back to high school where he was doing rock and roll.
Yeah, well, in fact, his first rock and roll single, of course. So he's just about to record Mixed Up Confusion, which is a rock and roll song in 1962. And then I kind of flip back, as you say, to the rock and roll that inspired that. And of course, ironically, the B-side of that song, of that single, was supposed to be That's All Right, Mama. Which was, of course, Elvis's first 45. So yeah, it all connects up.
Yeah, and it was important for him to go back to Minnesota. He did it repeatedly, more so than he sort of admits, or that is part of his myth. And he was showing off, right? He was very concerned about what people thought of him, that he was a success in New York, and he would come back regularly and show the clippings and talk about the people he had met, right? I mean, that was, for a guy with so much confidence, that struck me as like, wow, he's really needy when it comes to getting validated by his peers.
Yeah, I don't think he's looking for validation. I think that he felt that when he said this himself, when I came to Minneapolis, it seemed like a big town. When I left it, it seemed like a small town. I'm paraphrasing, but the point is that those were incredibly seminal months that he was there, and he was only there for 14 months. But and the relationships that he formed in that period were very, very important to him. He stayed close with Tony Glover. He stayed close with Bonnie Beecher, the sort of real girl from the North Country. He stayed in touch with these people a long time. What's interesting, this idea of Dylan getting far away from himself, is the point at which those relationships start to fragment is not when he becomes famous. It's much more about the idea that he hangs on to who he is. And one of the great exclusives that I got for the book was being able to sit in Tulsa and listen to the Tony Glover tapes that don't circulate from 62 and 63, where Dylan talks about himself. And the Bob Dylan that talks in those conversations is the young, pre-fame Bob Dylan. And you will never hear that person ever again. And Tony Glover actually said to my friend Marcus Whitman, when he drove Dylan to the airport at the end of the visit in July 1963, that Tony himself thought things are about to change. This is a, I'm not sure I'm going to see this guy again. And in a metaphorical sense, he never did. He never saw that person again. He saw Bob again. And it is a defining moment, and of course he's flying to go to the Newport Folk Festival, where he makes his first big breakthrough. I mean, he's literally leaves this little hometown enclave of fellow folkies, and turns up and plays to 15,000 people in Freebody Park in Rhode Island, and that's the big break. That's, suddenly he's a star, at least within the folk world.
He willed himself into becoming Bob Dylan, right? I mean, he chose the name, and then you see him as you read your book, forming it piece by piece, song by song, word by word. He put himself into situations where you had the sense that he was very driven. He said this, and he wanted fame, right?
Very driven, and also sadly, and and this is not a value judgment on him. I think it's a reflection of the nature of fame. He was forced to distance himself from a lot of people that he knew in the early days because they wanted him to stay that person. And the only way that he could move on was by actually shrugging them off, literally shrugging them off. And people in past biographies have kind of suggested there was a degree of cruelty in the way that he treated people like Kevin Crown, who he came to New York with, Paul Clayton, the great folklorist and folk singer, who had a lot of issues in his own right and ultimately killed himself in 1967. But he had to shrug those people off, and this idea that he's somehow responsible for what happened to those people because they couldn't attach themselves to this raging comet.
Talk about the people that helped him along the way. It seems like he got lucky. I don't know that you actually put it that way, but he seemed to be in the right place at the right time, where he got the review in the New York Times, which, I guess a lot of folks did, because Robert Shelton would write about his favorites or a girl singer that he was infatuated with.
Absolutely. I mean, the answer is, in all situations in life, happenstance plays its part. And one of the things that Dylan's come to appreciate over time, and does talk about, I think, wonderfully well in Chronicles, is this idea that it's like he's been transported, like, in Star Trek, into this moment of time and space, which he is. He lands in New York, in the village, in Greenwich Village, at the exact second that he needs to land there. It's city on the edge of forever, except he's not stopping World War II happening. He's, he creates a revolution because he's in the right place at the right time. And he realizes that. And the idea, and I quote Paul Colby from The Bitter End talking about this, when Dylan walked down the street, he would run into Pete Seeger. It wasn't an accident. It's, if you're walking those streets and it's February 1961, that's who you will run into. The first time that he goes up to Greystone, the mental hospital that Guthrie was kept in, Woody Guthrie was kept in, Rambler Jack Elliott is there. The guy whose records he stole from the Minneapolis Folkies, I mean, because where else would he be? The first weekend that he goes to stay with Guthrie's friends, Sid and Bob Gleason, and Cisco Houston is dossing in their house. Unbeknownst to Dylan, unbeknownst to everybody, Cisco has stage 4 cancer and knows that he has weeks to live. But Dylan gets to meet him and gets to spend time with him. And actually, I quote a line, Cisco's very last interview. He's talking about kids romanticizing his life, and the life he led on the road. And it seems obvious to me, he means Dylan, because, he saw Dylan 3 weeks before that interview, and he's crashing on the same sofa with Dylan. And of course, this kid is just a kid to Cisco Houston. He's not Bob Dylan. He's just another kid who's romanticized Houston's life. but he talks about it. He talks about this kids who romanticize his life, and he means Bob Dylan. In 2 weeks' time, Cisco Houston will be dead, and Bob Dylan will be carrying the baton for him. And of course, goes that very week, writes the song. Here's to Cisco, here's to Sonny and Cisco and Lead Belly too. You know, he writes himself into the mythology of American folk music in that one moment.
So there's no coincidences. It's what's the saying? Luck favors the prepared. He is in the right place at the right time. I found it interesting that for a guy who's so cynical and sarcastic sometimes in his writing and in his personal life, that he really did want to meet and visit Woody Guthrie in the hospital, not just once to say he did it, because he did. He went back and told everybody, I met him. I was, like, I'm a good guy. No, he was there constantly back and forth in the hospital. And that I don't know why that surprised me about Bob Dylan.
Well, of course, one of the things we didn't know until very recently is the amount of time that Bob spent visiting his friend Larry Keegan after he broke his back. And Larry was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, and was 16 when this happened. And Dylan was a kid, he was a year younger, I think, than Larry at that point. And so for a 15-year-old to have to deal with going to see his best friend in hospital in a wheelchair, and he's going to be there for the rest of his life. And Dylan, like you say, he didn't go once, he went regularly to see Larry, and that shows a certain spirit that doesn't come across. So when he goes and sees Woody, he's not traumatized by the experience. He knows what this is. It's not the same thing, Huntington's wheelchair, but it's still, your life has been completely turned upside down. And Dylan takes it in his stride. And as I demonstrate in the book, when Guthrie's moved to Brooklyn State Hospital, he's still going to visit him. He takes Tony Glover to see him in 1962. And Glover, partially so that Glover can go back to Minneapolis and tell everybody it's actually true. He really does know this guy.
But he had to hitch rides. It wasn't easy to get there, right?
No.
He made a real effort to do that. He met a lot of people. He played on Carolyn Hester's third album as backup. He was playing, I guess, harmonica. He hooks up with John Hammond through that, the producer, and who signed him to Columbia. That was fortuitous. And he meets Albert Grossman, right? So these things just sort of happened to him just within months almost of him hitting town.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing that I try and point out from the start is that there's something about this kid. In other words, it's not this idea that you become good. So if you ever listen to the full 15-song Decca audition tape of the Beatles from January 1962, and you go, Dick Rowe, a very fine A&R man, had good ears. I wouldn't have signed these bunch of clowns. It's garbage. This is lousy. 6 months later, when they do the EMI demos, they sound like a band. When the Stones do their Decca audition tape, the IBC demos, 6 months after that, that's a band. You listen to the Rolling Stones Decca audition tape, my God, they probably don't sound that good again for another 10 years. Dylan, no. There's a tape, which I write about in the book, that Tulsa have just acquired. Nobody's ever heard the tape. And it's a tape of Dylan in Madison on his way to New York. This is January 61. And he's playing songs with Danny Kalb, great blues guitarist. And Dylan does about a dozen songs, and he's playing harmonica, which is the first tape where we hear Dylan play harmonica. And he's doing all sorts of songs. It's not just Guthrie songs. The myth, he just played Guthrie, shut the fuck up, no, he does. I Heard That Lonesome Whistle by Hank Williams, a song he was still recording in 1989. He recorded it for Oh Mercy. He's doing all sorts of material on that tape. But the amazing thing about that tape is it's Bob Dylan. It's Bob Dylan. He's not in New York yet. So when you hear that, you realize that when he came into New York, he blew through that place like a hurricane because people went, what the hell is this? I mean, there were people who went, I can't sing, but the effect of hearing him was immediate, good or bad.
He was fully formed as an artist when he landed. And he very soon started writing some amazing songs, although that first album, of course, had a lot of traditional, we'd call them covers. You call Let Me Die in My Footsteps Bob Dylan's first masterpiece. Why do you think that's the case?
It's funny, I've been singing that song a lot in the last few months, because if you think about the whole COVID situation, I will not go down under the ground because somebody tells me that death's coming round. I will not bury myself down to die. When I go to my grave, my head will be high. Let me die in my footsteps before I go down under the ground. That's a very contemporary song. You wouldn't have to change it very much to make it about the 2020 pandemic, would you? The answer is, I think it's his first masterpiece because it's the first time he taps into a feeling, in that particular case, the threat of nuclear destruction, that speaks not just to his mates and him, but speaks, much more than Blowing in the Wind, which was written within weeks of that song, because it says something about the human spirit. It's that idea, I'm not going to bury myself underground in a bunker and worry about when the end of the world is going to come.
You outlined the way he would write, and some of this is visible in Don't Look Back and other film that's extant. But you talk about him writing not with a guitar. He would be at a typewriter, and he could get up in the middle of a card game and go over to the typewriter, and while everyone's partying, drinking, smoking, doing it, and he's just focused, and I guess he would use his pencil. I mean, you've seen the manuscript. I guess he would correct with a pencil and the typewriter, but be so focused. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's extraordinary is that, people that I talk to about this phenomenon, I sort of go, I'm sorry, I don't understand how that works. And they say, no, it really is crazy. There's no way that you should be able to. Hard rains are going to fall. To write that at a typewriter while all of your contemporaries are playing poker behind you, and in your head, you can hear a tune, albeit a traditional tune, and just go, oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? You're thinking how. But I've seen the manuscript, and I've seen the handwritten corrections, the wavy gravy manuscript, typescript, that is the one that he wrote, and he kept doing it. There's the evidence is that certainly up to the accident, that was the way he wrote songs. It does seem unbelievable that you would write them on a typewriter, but it's a kind of thinking that I just couldn't get inside. I don't know how you do that.
It makes me understand a little more about the way he would then perform them, because he was very much a performance artist in a sense of how he would confront the audience, how the work was never the same. He wasn't a recording artist that would just reproduce music. He's never done that. It was always different. And it seems to me that the important part to him was those words. And then when he goes to perform them, even to today, he's looking for new ways to break through with those words, and new arrangements and new time signatures and new keys, and the bands that he's put around him have had to just be able to stay up with that. And the audiences, a lot of them, they give up, because I remember seeing him live, and all of a sudden in the middle of just incomprehensible, I would hear him go, "Tangled Up in Blue," and I'm like, oh, that's what he's singing. I had no idea.
Yeah, well, there were a few years when that was not because he was reinventing himself, it's because he was a little worse for wear. But yeah, sometimes he was actually doing something brilliant and transcendental. Yeah, you can't always assume that it's a brilliant reinterpretation just because it's unintelligible. But they're definitely, you know, there's one of the things that happens, particularly in the early years, and I've written about this, is this idea that sometimes the pace of change is so great that even Dylan can't keep up with himself. So, you know, you have a situation where he plays the town hall in New York in April of 1963, and then he plays Carnegie Hall 6 months later and plays almost nothing from the set list that he played in April. And he did 23 songs in the April show, and basically scrapped almost all of them by October and played 17 brand new songs, you know. And they're brilliant. I mean, they're not 17 songs that it's written off the cuff. It's, you know, it's Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll. It's Percy's song. It's Lay Down Your Weary Tune. It's works of genius, you know. And the people who were there, pretty much, I'm guessing 3/4 of the people who were at the town hall were also at the Carnegie Hall. I mean, what were they thinking? You know, that to 6 months later have this completely unrecognizable shift. And a shift forwards. It's not, you know, it's not a sideways shift, you know. And I love to talk about those things in the book, like when he plays Highway 61 to the Beatles, you know, and the Beatles have just delivered Help, which is not a great album by any stretch. You know, I mean, hats off to the Beatles. Instead of just going, I give up. Why are we even trying to compete? You know, instead of that, they go out and record Rubber Soul and follow that up with Revolver. So that's fine. I mean, they proved that they deserve to belong in the same arena. But it must be dispiriting. Somebody plays you Highway 61 and you just recorded Help Me 'Cause I'm Down.
Which is a song that even John admits was influenced by Bob Dylan up to that, but that was maybe John's first attempt to speak personally, right? That particular song, Help.
Yeah, well, of course, it was about the acid trip when they were dosed. And I talk about this in the book because, of course, Dylan had the same experience 3 weeks later. You know, so they were dosed secretly at a party at a dentist, him and George and Paddy and Cynthia. And I talked to Paddy about this, and, you know, it was really traumatic that, you know, they didn't know what had happened, and they were, you know, it really fried their brains. And Dylan, of course, the same thing happens to him. Now, of course, he's already taken LSD, so he's not, what the hell is this? But he was dosed at a party at the Savoy Hotel, and somebody else who was at that party was Vince Taylor, the British rocker. He goes off to Paris the next day and walks on stage and announces that he's Jesus Christ, who, of course, Vince Taylor was the model for Ziggy Stardust. That's where that idea comes from, that particular night. Well, Dylan also got dosed at the same party, but Dylan didn't announce that he was Jesus Christ. He just wrote like a Rolling Stone instead.
You again, it's hard to keep up with the amount of scholarship you've done, and I imagine it was tough for Dylan to keep up with himself and the amount of material he was producing. One of the things that occurs to me is that even in the early days, his voice and his style was very compelling. Everyone who said, "Wow," I mean, he can't really, in terms of singing melodies, he's not a harmonic singer like a Joan Baez or some of the others. He's a great writer, but it was his style and his voice tended to either turn people off or they got it. I mean, I saw the quote from Joyce Carol Oates. She called the voice as if sandpaper could sing. And of course, David Bowie, when he wrote about him, said a voice like sand and glue. So these are probably people that loved him. So,
yeah, well, I mean, there's a great quote which was told to me. Tony Bennett was asked whether he thought Dylan was a great singer. And Tony Bennett obviously is a great singer. And Bennett said, well, I don't know if he's a great singer, but he sure can phrase. What a great line. And that's it. Yeah, he's nailed it, you know.
And that's what they say about Frank Sinatra as well, right? That
Yeah.
his phrasing was unparalleled, and the way he would deliver a song, so unexpected. And if you're a musician trying to follow somebody like this and trying to memorize where things go, and you get somebody like a Dylan who constantly is rephrasing and rethinking that, and a Sinatra, it just blows your mind as a musician. You know, Dylan he wouldn't even, he'd keep that guitar going, and then he'd come in whenever he felt like it. Johnny Cash did this as well, right?
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, that's a folk thing. I mean, that's not, he didn't invent that. That's totally a folk thing. I mean, the idea of you play 4/4, you play 4/4. No, 5, 6, 7. I remember David Mansfield telling me this because he didn't come from a folk background, and they were doing the Rolling Thunder rehearsals, and Dylan kept breaking the lines, and he's like, "What the hell's going on?" And somebody said, "It's a folk thing," you know. And yeah, it's you know, that idea that he's constantly keeping you on your toes, you know, as an audience member, that you can't just switch off. You have to engage with him. Now, it's interesting that Dylan, in a sense, a lot of his most famous songs were made famous by other people, and that he's an incredibly widely covered artist. I mean, the latest issue of Uncut is a whole CD of people doing Bob Dylan covers. Most of them are appalling. There's a very good Richard Thompson, This Wheel's on Fire, and my good friend Thurston Moore doing Buckets of Rain, but the rest of it's pretty much a frisbee. But the interesting thing is I've listened to a lot of Dylan covers over the years, and I have a lot of personal favorites. There are only 2 Dylan covers, in my not so humble opinion, that are better than the original. Only 2.
I've got to ask because it was coming up next. So.
Television, Knocking on Heaven's Door, and Van Morrison, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. They're the only 2 where I'd actually say, you know what, I think I prefer theirs to Bob. And Bob's versions of both are great. You know, Van Morrison is genuinely a genius singer. And the television Knocking on Heaven's Door is just one of the most sublime moments of a truly, truly great band.
Yeah, my question was going to be your top 3 favorite Dylan covers, but you're like, no, there's only 2.
There's only 2. Sorry.
But, Clinton, I'm sorry. There's got to be more. There are thousands of covers. He's probably more well-known for the cover song. When people don't like Bob Dylan's song, I play them Adele, and they're like, "Oh yeah, oh I love this, oh I love this song," you know. Or
yeah, but I mean, the problem you have is that, and I love Adele's version of "To Make You Feel My Love," but it's an atrocious song. It's an absolutely I mean, the fact it's written by Bob Dylan is irrelevant. It's just the most cliched piece of twaddle you could imagine, and so it's ironic that a very, very good singer like Adele should choose to pick a love song by the greatest author of love songs of the 20th century and pick a complete turkey. You know, she can pick Simple Twist of Fate. She can pick Tomorrow Is a Long Time. You know, Tomorrow Is a Long Time, right? Now, you want to talk about people doing covers. I mean, how many great covers are there of Tomorrow's a Long Time? Sandy Denny, gorgeous. Rod Stewart, a masterpiece. You know, I mean, there's so many beautiful versions of that song. None of them, let me say, come close to Bob's Whitmore demo. But you know, that's always the challenge. You know, it's like if I had to pick the 50 best versions of Mr. Tambourine Man, the Byrds are not getting in the top 50 because all 50 are by Bob Dylan. You know, I don't mean that Dylan does one version, the version I'm Bringing It All Back Home, and that's great and that's better than the Byrds. I mean, you know, how many times has he done that song definitively? And everyone is different, you know, and I can reel them off if you want me to.
You're counting Bob Dylan's covers of himself, and you're right, he almost treats it as a cover band would by adopting the song to their style and he keeps changing style. So every time he's changed, he covers his own song like a new band would. And I get that, but I guess I'm gonna push you on this because, all right, no,
luck.
seriously, good luck. Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash had a real feel for Bob Dylan's music. They did a number of things together. He covered Bob Dylan.
Yeah,
Not,
but I mean,
not,
I'd say, obviously, if I was picking a Bob Dylan song from the Johnny Cash cavern, I'd pick Wanted Man, obviously. But of course, that gets me off the hook because Bob never sang the damn thing. I mean, the version they put out in the bootleg series doesn't count. The San Quentin version is the definitive version of that song, but there's no Dylan version to compare it to. So I'm off the hook. You know, if you do a Dylan song and you're the only one that does it, you're okay. You know, that's what you need to do. You know.
Okay, Nina Simone. Just
Oh,
like Tom Thumb.
well, just like Tom Thumb's Blues is my favorite Nina Simone Dylan cover. But I love the Nina Simone versions. I mean, they are exquisite. Yeah. But you're not going to say it's better than Liverpool 66. Nobody's seriously going to suggest that. You know.
Okay. You've heard Anthony and the Johnsons Knocking on Heaven's Door?
No, I haven't. No.
Oh my God. All right.
No.
We'll send you that.
It's not going to be better than televisions, is it? You know.
You just blew my mind. I found something you didn't catch. I'm sorry. That's how about Brian Ferry, who continually inspired and comes back to him, put an entire album out of Dylan covers.
Yeah, unfortunately,
the top 10.
Oh, Hard Rain. I mean, the thing is that, you know, Brian Ferry's, unfortunately, this becomes personal then, because you know, you've got to remember, you know, when I heard Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall by Brian Ferry, I didn't know it was a Bob Dylan song. I didn't know anything. You know, I mean, I was a huge Roxy Music fan. I was 13. I had heard Dylan at that point, but I hadn't heard his version of Hard Rain. And I heard Hard Rain by Brian Ferry on Top of the Pops. And I'm like, what the hell is this? I mean, it was extraordinary, and I can remember it to this day. And of course, I adore that version. And yeah, of course, I'm a huge fan. But obviously, it's not going to beat the Boston 1975 Rolling Thunder review version. So every time you give me a version that I like, I'm still going to pick a Dylan version that's better.
Okay. Let's talk about, like, I was thinking about like a lightning round here, where I would just throw something at you and you would give like a just off the top of your head sort of response, first thing that comes to mind. So what's the meaning and importance of Dylan's Neverending Tour starting in 1988?
Well, first of all, you're assuming that the Neverending Tour is still going, I'm guessing. I'm not under that illusion. I mean, anyone who was paying attention knows that came to an end in 2012. So if we're talking about the real Neverending Tour, which is the one that ran from 1990, i.e. the end of the G.E. Smith era, to 2012, the Neverending Tour kept Dylan alive, kept Dylan interested, and kept Dylan going during the worst writing block that he ever had, including the late 60s. You know, I mean, the irony of it is that the first 7 years of the Neverending Tour are both the most interesting and the most creative in his functioning as a performing artist. And they're at a point where he can't write a song for love nor money. The greatest songwriter of the 20th century spends 6.5 years. I mean, I've been through the notebooks at Tulsa. There are a few scraps of ideas, but there's nothing. There's no spark. It's gone. Where is it? And yet, night after night, he's reinventing the canon. And not just his canon, the canon of popular song. You know, I mean, he's doing 130 covers in that period.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the band, and they're like, we got to learn, what, 10 more for tonight?
Yeah, no, it is. And not just that, it's that idea, you know, the Heartbreakers talk about this in 87, you know, where he turns around and says, right, I'm going to do Desolation Row. And they're going, but we haven't rehearsed it, Bob. And he goes, it's in the key of C. Well, and they're expected, and it's an 11-minute song. It's not like, how do you busk your way through Desolation Row? Well, the answer is we have the tape. I think it's Helsinki, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful.
You heard the Springsteen aphorism when he backed up Chuck Berry, opened up for him, and then the band would stand on stage, and Chuck finally got his $1,000 backstage and came out, right, and he was ready to play finally, 5 minutes after 8 o'clock or whatever. And the band turns to him, Springsteen turns to him and says, "What are we going to play?" And Chuck Berry says, "We're going to play Chuck Berry songs."
Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, but, in fairness, what musician doesn't know Johnny Be Good? But if the guy that's turning around and says, we're going to play Bob Dylan songs, it's Desolation Row is not Johnny Be Good, I quote that in the book about that Ken Buttrey told me, that story about Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, recording that. And of course, the thing that really blows the musicians' minds is that at no point did Dylan say to them, "Oh, and incidentally, it's 15 minutes long." It's not, I mean, you got to think, national musicians, they don't record anything over 3 minutes. And Dylan records this song. Not only does he run it down once, but he then keeps going and keeps going and keeps going.
Do you subscribe to the theory? I think Dylan said something about that he's playing on this Neverending Tour because he made a bargain with God. That was the deal, was he had to play live for the rest of his life or some such in order for the gifts he was given.
Well, I mean, obviously that's a very metaphorical way of putting it, but I mean, Dylan's commitment to the Neverending Tour is real. Dylan sees himself as a performer. We talked about Cisco Houston, and whether you think Dylan really feels this way or not, I think all the evidence is that he sees himself very much in that mold. The idea that Cisco was playing at Gerd's Folk City 2 weeks before he died, and he died in Sacramento, incidentally, so it's a long way back. I mean, he literally played until he couldn't play and then went home to die. And I think that actually does have an attraction to Dylan. Obviously, because of the COVID situation, his worldview may have changed. And the Neverending Tour may have come to a natural end. Who knows? But he sees himself as a performing artist. He always has. And he said many times, "I write new songs to have something to play." And the albums aren't the object of the exercise. The opportunity to play the songs is the object of the exercise. And yeah, he definitely buys into that. I mean, whether it's a deal with God, I don't know, but it's, it's what gives his life purpose. And the period when he was off the road, the 2 long periods that he was off the road, between 66 and 74 and between 81 and 86. I mean, he did a very brief tour in 84, but really was off the road. In both cases, he went off the rails. I mean, quite literally. I mean, in both cases, he got into very, very bad habits, and was doing things he shouldn't be doing, and was heading off a cliff, frankly. And I think he realized that without that structure, he'd be dead. And certainly some of the shows that I saw at the beginning of 1990s, one got that impression that this was the only thing keeping him alive.
It obviously wasn't because he needed the money. A lot of bands these days.
Well, it never is. Yeah.
Well, but they have to tour, a lot of them, and they sell merchandise and T-shirts.
Of
and,
course.
Touring is sort of the way they make money. But with Dylan, no. Let's try the lightning round again. This time, instead of 10-minute answers, we'll try 30-second. I'm not blaming you. I love it.
I did warn you up front. I did say it's not the number of questions, it's how long the answers are. That's your problem.
You did warn me. All right, here's a short one. What 2 or 3 achievements will be Dylan's legacy and why?
I made a joke. Somebody said in the Observer asked me to fill in these kind of 6-question things, and one of them was, "What has Dylan been responsible for?" And I wrote Ed Sheeran. The man has a lot to answer for. I mean, all he can do is do what he must. It's not, the influence that it has I hope that people will still be listening to me in 50 or 100 years' time. I believe they will. But I think a lot of the great things that Dylan's done will fall by the wayside. That's what happens. You know, one of the reasons I write is to say, yeah, we all know about Like a Rolling Stone. Have you heard this? You know.
So then if I throw another one at you, name your top 3 Dylan songs and why.
It's three Dylan songs or performances?
I guess, right, 2 different things, right? Because you're obsessed with his bootlegs and his live work as well. Well, let's do both. Let's just make it fun. 3 songs as a song, and then 3 performances.
I mean, the reason I say it like that is that I find that what are your 3 favorite Dylan songs? I mean, it's like I think the answer is fairly bland, not because I've got no taste, but just because, you know, if you write Visions of Johanna, one of the greatest poems ever written, and then put it to music, and then deliver a performance for the ages, you know, how can anybody not put that in their top 3? It's one of the top 3 songs of all time. Forget about Bob Dylan songs. Tangled Up in Blue, same thing. You know, how do you even imagine to have put that work together? You know, the idea that the current poet laureate, Simon Armitage, thinks that Tangled Up in Blue is quite good. You know, the entire collected works of Simon Armitage have less poetry in them than the first verse of Tangled Up in Blue. And so, you know, that's the problem. You know, where do you set those kind of benchmarks? That's why I say it's easier with performances, because there are performances that contain the universe, but they're in that performance. The song has to be great. It can't be To Make You Feel My Love. It doesn't matter how well Bob does it, or Adele.
So tell us, if we had access to the bootlegs, and more of them are coming online, which is cool for us. We're sort of entering your world where you've been swimming for a while in these rarefied seas of access, but they're coming out more and more, the bootleg series, and they're copywriting this stuff. For those of us who love to sit and read your books with headphones on, and as you mention a song, pull it up and listen to it as you talk about it, give us those 3 bootleg performances or live performances that you think are indispensable.
Well, of course, the 3 that I give you today will be different tomorrow, just so you know. So, you know, I off the top of my head, the all-time greatest live performance of Bob Dylan, in my opinion, is Caribbean Wind. And he only ever did it once. He did it the 12th of November, 1980, at the Warfield Theatre in San Francisco. It is on Trouble No More, the bootleg series, whatever number it is, 15, is it? The gospel bootleg series. That performance is on there. Unfortunately, it's missing the intro, where Dylan compares himself to Leadbelly, which I consider to be an integral part of the song, because Dylan delivers the punchline like a true stand-up comedian. Because he goes, people said to Leadbelly, have you changed? But he didn't change. He was the same man. And then he goes into Caribbean Wind. And the point of that is that Dylan has written this song that could sit in the middle of side 3 of Blonde on Blonde, but he's a born-again Christian. But he didn't change. He was the same man. And the beauty of that performance is that Dylan rides the tail of the song. He doesn't know how this is going to go. This is a slalom ride down a hill at 100 miles an hour, and it could end in a car crash. Actually, it does end in a car crash because the band don't know how to end the song. It just comes to a halt. But Dylan's delivery and the intensity with which he performs that is just, I can listen to it endlessly. And I remember I played the tape of that to Greil Marcus, and Greil was at the show, the lucky bastard. But he hadn't heard it in 20 years at this point. And I played in the soundboard recording of Caribbean Wind. And we both just sat there and listened to it. And he was like, wow.
Okay, that's one. You have 2 more live performances, bootlegs.
Well, again, I'm going to pick things that I, from a personal point of view. Tambourine Man from the first night in Manchester in 1995, in April 95. I saw a lot of shows on that tour. Dylan was doing a Tambourine Man with no guitar. He was just standing there with a harmonica. And he did it every night, starting in Prague, the greatest Bob Dylan show I ever saw, first night of the 1995 tour. And he would do this acoustic set, and he was doing a lot of songs he did in 1966 at the acoustic shows, and they're better than 66. He's that in the zone, and they're astonishing. And he did it in Manchester in 95. And you have to remember that it's the first time Bob had played Manchester since a certain 1966 show. It's 29 years later. And he played that song on May the 17th, 1966. And he's playing it again. And to a stand-up crowd at Manchester Apollo, my hometown, and every single verse, you got a stand-up ovation, standing ovation. Literally, at the end of every verse, people spontaneously just went, wow. You know, and, you know, he was, what, 54 at that point? You know, past the sell-by date for a lot of people. And that was an amazing moment. I mean, there are great tambourine mans from the 60s. I'm not suggesting there aren't, but that was an amazing moment, you know, and that's why I saw so many Bob Dylan shows over the years, just because it doesn't matter if you see 3 or 4 shows that are okay, because it's worth it for that moment when you find that moment.
Even if, like Grail Marcus, you don't remember it.
Well, yeah. Well, you need to be reminded of it. Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so that's 2. One more, if you had to dig and we held your feet to the fire.
Again, I'm going to cheat and pick a performance that I was at. The 5th night of the Earl's Court, 1981, 30th of June. And Dylan did Simple Twist of Fate. Again, a song he was doing most nights. And it was the 1981 rewrite. So he rewrote all the lyrics, some great rewrites. And he's totally into it. He's in the moment, and it's a horrible venue. Earl's Court, 17,000. You know, it's ricocheting acoustics, but they're great shows. They're amazing shows. One of which is on that Trouble No More set, but not the night I'm talking about. And he's in the middle of the song, and he does something he's never done before or since. He puts himself in the moment when he wrote the song, and he sings, "I remember Susie and the way that she talked." And it's just, the hairs on my back. You know, when I heard him sing that line live and I knew he'd sung it, I went, oh my God. And we've been arguing for years about, I always said it was a song about Susie Rotolo, but it was like, bang. And he's never done that. I've never known him ever do that with any song, ever. You know, and that's not always the case. I mean, Lou Reed used to sing I Can't Stand It and always use the real name of the person he wrote it about, you know, which is pretty unusual for Lou. But, you know, but in Dylan's case, to do that, but he was so into it. He was there. He put himself in the moment, you know. So there you are. But I'm not going to stick to those 3. Tomorrow the number will be different.
I'm not going to, it's like pulling teeth with you, and I'm not going to do it again. So yeah, I'm looking at my lesson.
Okay.
For you, does Dylan have, he changed so often. Is there a period that he went through that really stands out for you? Again, if we were to put the big spotlight and just for the neophyte, for the beginner, is there a period of his life that really stands out? Maybe it's one of the most popular, maybe it's one that's overlooked that for you really stands out.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons I cheated with the first volume, the new book, is because you don't get any blips, you know. You know, it's one glorious triumph artistically. I'm not saying his life was easy. I'm just saying that. So one of the joys of writing the book is that I don't have to deal with the peaks and troughs. You know, it's just, my God, another masterpiece. My God, another masterpiece. And, you know, it all ends in this wonderfully dramatic fashion, smash, bang, wallop. And of course, you're left hanging. You know, where does it go? The bad news is in volume 2, it goes like this. It's up and down, it's up and down, it's up and down. Because that's what life is like. You know, it's not one series of triumphs.
But you would say that first 5 years is one huge triumph, one huge period to, and for an artist who's been around as long as him, that's a legitimate time frame. It's less than 10% of his professional career. So yeah, and it does. I was going to say, the way you wrote this with the flashbacks and very cinematic, and one success after another, and it builds and it builds, and you're just on this wild ride. You really are. And then the way you ended it, I can't believe your editors let you do this. It's like Thelma and Louise or something, you know, at the end.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it is. It's exactly that. In fact, we were actually the very last page was gonna be the memo that his editor from Macmillan, Bob Markle, sent to the rest of Macmillan to tell him that Tarantula was cancelled because Dylan had fallen off his bike. And it's a great little memo. And that was going to be the last page of the book. But of course, I then realized that I want that to be the first page of the next book. So I'm afraid it got pulled because that's how the next volume starts. You know.
Yeah, and with the accident, because you really don't even talk about the motorcycle accident itself here.
No.
It's almost, you leave it into the realm of myth or whatever the reader brings to it. I have to warn people about your work, and I say, don't start here. You got to start. You got to be ready for this. You got to get yourself up to speed on the basics, and then go to Clinton to fill in and color and feather and give you the tone and give you the backstory. Because don't expect him to just lay out, here's what happened, and then here's what happened, and here's what happened.
It's almost like somebody invented Spotify or YouTube for me, because prior to Spotify and YouTube, I'd be talking about things that you couldn't just go, oh, gee, I wonder what that does sound like. Now, I'm actually able, you know, most people tell me that, you know, YouTube in particular, that they can actually pull up, you know, Tambourine Man from Manchester 95. You can actually find the damn thing on YouTube and listen to it, you know, and that's a wonderful thing, because if I write and I don't send you back to the music, I have failed, miserably failed. Yeah.
Well, you do that. You send me back constantly. I can't read what you write without being plugged in and turned on and have music playing. It just doesn't make sense.
But one of the weird things about doing the book, and this is, I could try and take the credit for this, but I won't. So when I wrote the little prelude to the book, is me talking about a really important evening in Dylan's life in July 1961. So on the 29th of July 1961, Dylan played the Riverside Church, which is still there in Harlem. And I point out this is incredibly important because it was Dylan's first radio show. It's the first time he got written about in the New York Times and the New York Daily News. All his friends were there. He got to play on the same bill as all of his idols. Oh, and he met Susie Rotolo that night, the great early love of his life. All of these amazing things happen on this one evening. So I start the book there. What I didn't, because I just wasn't thinking about it, is that the book ends 5 years to the day later. The motorcycle accident is the 29th of July, 1966. And I'm not taking credit for it. It was a pure fluke. I just went, oh my God, that's 5 years.
Wow.
So that's how tight the window is.
So many connections. And I want to, again, pull back and ask you if you have, trick question maybe, do you have a favorite Dylan album and why? And you can't say no, I love them all.
I don't love them all. One of the interesting things about Bob is that for a major artist, he has made some of the worst music. of the 20th century. I mean, it's not, I mean, 20th and 21st century, should I say. I mean, you know, the Christmas album is unspeakable. You know, it's just, if I made that record and went to a record company, I'd have sticks thrown at me. I mean, you know. No, but Bob Dylan has managed to hit some real lows. I mean, you know, I can't think of anyone of his stature that has had a more erratic recording career.
Continue on that vein, then. Name a few other, you know, terrific, terrible low points that he's had.
Well, I mean, in terms of albums of original songs, I have a fondness, I think, for all of them. I mean, you know, even Knocked Out Loaded has Brownsville Girl on it. I mean, you know, you can't. I mean, how could you denigrate an album that has this 12-minute masterpiece that nobody else could have written and performed? You know, there is nobody on the planet who could have done that extraordinary song. But the fact that there's 28 minutes of other filler, you know, we can tolerate that. You know, so yeah, I mean, and yet at the same time, the heights are such heights. You know, as somebody, an English critic referred to Down in the Groove as the 41st greatest album ever made, because it's the 41st best Dylan album. And the point he was kind of making was that there's Dylan and there's everyone else. And that, you know, there is a sense of that often. And I say that, you know, as obviously, you know, my all-time favorite rock album isn't a Bob Dylan album. It's not, I'm wedded to that idea, but I understand that mentality, you know. So that's a long-winded way of saying, again, a very boring answer. Blood on the Tracks is my favorite album, and it's my favorite album because it was the first Bob Dylan album that I bought on the day of its release. And everyone had been telling me for the previous 4 years that Bob Dylan was washed up and that the only good Bob Dylan was from the 60s. And I put that record on and thought, my God, this is a washed up Bob Dylan. And I've always loved the record. And fortunately, I heard the test pressing very, very quickly. I used to buy bootlegs. In fact, I think I write about it in my bootleg book. Even then, I was only 14 at the time, but I was already buying bootleg albums. And so I heard Joachim Antique, you know, within weeks of that album coming out. So I've always had that extraordinary fondness for both. But if I wanted to cheat, I would say my all-time favorite Bob Dylan album is the Blood on the Tracks test pressing.
It's okay. It's not cheating. You're just, it's like you have the answer sheet. It's not cheating when you've done your research and you know the answer.
It's out officially. Record Store Day came out.
See?
It's on vinyl. You know.
You're just ahead of the curve. Everyone else is just catching up, you know. But go on with this. You've got Blood on the Tracks. But interesting, because it's obviously considered a masterpiece, but it's not in his sort of classic period. It's you know, maybe 10 years later. But give me one or two other albums that you think are essential, that if you know, Desert Island Time, which is silly, but what else would you have put you know, to the test? You would say, no, this is what I have to have, these other two albums.
Well, I mean, you always have that problem. I mean, if you're on the desert island or you're comparing him with other artists, you know, in the real world, I mean, you know, if you're saying what are the top 20 rock albums of all time, or the top 100, the top 20, which Bob Dylan albums get in there? And, you know, I mean, you know, you can be silly, but yeah, it's Freewheeling, it's Bringing It, it's Highway 61, it's Blonde on Blonde, it's John Wesley Harding, it's a version of the Basement Tapes. In my opinion, it should be the 14-song Lassie tape. It's Blood on the Tracks. There are albums after that where Dylan comes close. If he'd have issued The Shot of Love, I would have issued. If he'd issued The Infidels, I would have issued. If he'd have issued The Oh Mercy, I would have issued. Then they'd be in there. They're not.
Talk about Oh Mercy, because Bob Dylan's his chronicles, his fictional autobiography, however you want to put it,
Yeah, has that great chapter. Yeah.
He spends a third of that book. I counted the pages. He spends a third of that book talking about Daniel Lanois and the making of Oh Mercy. I was shocked. It is one of my favorites. I was very happy, but I got done thinking, this is the first volume of his entire life, and he spends that much. And now, obviously, he wrote more, and you've seen some of that that didn't make it into that book. It's a rather thin volume, right? But
Well,
you know,
yeah, and the Oh Mercy chapter is there because the volume that he delivered was thinner still.
yeah,
The
yeah.
truth of the matter is he delivered, so I'm told, he delivered a 40,000 word book,
Mm.
and was told, this isn't enough, Bob. We can't publish this. And so he looked around at stuff that he had lying around, and he wrote a bunch of sleeve notes for what never happened, a series of sort of expanded album releases, like the Elvis Costello Ryko disc releases, one of which was Oh Mercy. And so he expanded that into a chapter, a very long chapter, but yeah. I don't know whether that's true. I mean, as far as I know, it's true. It certainly reads that way. But as I say in the new book, one of the problems with Chronicles is that Dylan had this idea. The very first line of the book, of my book, is Dylan talking about his autobiography in an interview in April 1963. Now, even I hadn't thought about this very clearly, but when I did think about it, I thought, that's a month before he releases Freewheeling. This guy has sold, in the entire world, has sold less than 5,000 records at this point, and he's thinking about his autobiography. That is a man with a sense of destiny. And the book that he talks about writing is Chronicles. I mean, it's the New York bit of Chronicles, but it is that book that he wrote 40 years later.
A lot of people were disappointed, obviously, in that book because and he constantly goes against your expectations. That's how he lives his life. We expect him to go against our expectations, but there's no way that he gave an overview of his life at all, or even many insights. Did you think? I mean, were you as disappointed, or were you happy with just another work of art from him, or did the outtakes or the manuscripts tell more?
Well, to be honest, I didn't have any real expectation that he'd deliver what people wanted. So and so when I started reading it, my initial response to it was, this is pretty well written. And it's interesting to hear him talking about these things in a way that is not familiar, that doesn't have the normal Dylan tone to it. I pretty quickly realized that there was a lot of subterfuge going on, that there were lines that just go, no, I know that didn't happen, and you know that didn't happen, Bob. So, I can't take what you're saying at face value. As I think we were talking about earlier, this idea, you've got to accept that Dylan is flagging the idea you need to question everything you read all the time. And I think all these people saying, oh, he stole that line from a Jack London novel. What, you think he doesn't know that? You think he's never heard of search engines? Come on.
So
Um,
back
so
to Daniel Lanois, because he worked with him a couple times, and you can tell in Chronicles how he appreciated what Daniel Lanois brought to Dylan's circumstance at the time that he did, and he sounded very proud of the results. And so I just wonder, someone like yourself, those two albums, Time Out of Mind, Oh Mercy, that Daniel Lanois produced, do you feel those are, because I believe Time Out of Mind didn't win a Grammy, or there was
album of the year.
yeah. What's your opinion of that? Do you think that was an anomaly, or do you think that's one of his high points, those albums?
Well, I mean, Oh Mercy, definitely. I mean, I think I've written somewhere, if I haven't, I should have. Oh Mercy is the last time that Bob Dylan has within his grasp a masterpiece. an absolute masterpiece, an album that stands alongside Blood on the Tracks, that stands alongside Highway 61, that stands alongside Freewheeling, and it's there. He can touch it, he can smell it, he can taste it. It isn't the album he released, I'm afraid.
In what way? What do you mean?
Well, that's a very, I mean, it would take days for us to go into that. But I mean, you know, essentially the recording process had got away from him to a point where the decision-making process became too complicated, too difficult for him. And the choices that he made, some were good, some were not so good. That happens. It's not, you know, it's not a condemnation, you know. I'm sure that soliloquy that Shakespeare cut from Hamlet was even better than the ones he included. You know, it's that, you know, who knows?
So you agree with Dylan when he favors that "Oh Mercy" in Chronicles and puts that as a high point. You
yeah,
feel,
oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that he would make a statement for an album that got good reviews but didn't sell spectacularly, to sort of say, you know what, I'm not going to write about Highway 61. I'm going to write about, and you know, and I mean, I say in the book, in the new book, you know, Bring It All Back Home, I describe as Dylan's most innovative album, and I believe that. It is because it's so far ahead of the curve. It's so far ahead of where anybody else is. You know, and it was recorded in January 1965. You know, the Beatles are still writing "I Love You, Luby, Luby, Luby." You know, the Beach Boys are still surfing in the bloody trees. You know, nobody is doing anything. And Dylan writes "Tambourine Man" and "Subterranean Homesick Blues" and "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue" and "On the Road Again." I mean, it's dazzling. Oh, and he had so many great songs. I'll leave off "Farewell Angelina" because that's one of my throwaway songs. You know, it's totally so far on the cutting edge. There's an album, I remember Jeff, Bob's manager, telling me that Bring It All Back Home went gold in like 1988. And it took that long in America. And I'm like, Jesus Christ.
what are we waiting for?
So, you know, it's not always about, you know, the world will catch up in time.
Right.
And Dylan's later work, I don't know how that's going to be framed. That Dylan could write a song as great as My Edition of You or Key West on the last album at the age of 79, to me, is extraordinary. I can't think of any I can't think of any artist, period, working in a performance field who could produce work of that quality in their 8th decade on this planet. You know, so I'm certainly not suggesting that. Well, from 1966 onwards, it's downhill. It's just one series of catastrophes after the other. You know, that's a different challenge, but it's just as interesting a story.
So Rough and Rowdy Ways, you were happy with, I assume.
I was just delighted it existed. You know, I mean, there's things on there that I go, not sure why we need another Jump Blues from you, Bob. You know, to go along with the other 27 you've been performing at most shows for the last 20 years. I get it. You like Jump Blues, don't we all? But, you know, there should be a kind of moratorium. You know, there should be a committee that forces you to only put one on each album. You know, I mean, and that's what B-sides are for, Bob. You know, but
bootlegs, yeah, leave them off entirely.
Yeah, well, all that, but you know, I mean, I being an English person, you know, it was always that thing I loved about B-sides on singles. That it's like, this is the songs that we weren't allowed to put on the album.
Yeah, that's how they snuck them in.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been talking for a while. I want to cover a few real quick. And again, if you can give a quick response, I'll throw a song title out. You give me the sort of, all right, it's like I'm writing a book. I'm asking Clinton Heylin for his little book blurb, literally one-liner. Okay, can we try to do that?
We can try. Yeah. There's no success like failure, but yeah.
All right, let me throw one at you. To Make You Feel My Love.
But we've already trashed that one, so we can't trash it any more than I already have.
Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Well, it reinvented Too Much Monkey Business and gave REM a reason to reinvent Subterranean Homesick Blues.
Blowing in the Wind.
Barcelona, 1984. Must be on YouTube. Watch it. The greatest reinvention of a tired, cliched song in the history of music. Stunning.
Queen Jane, Approximately.
Again, 12th of October, 1989, third night, Beacon Theatre, New York, 10-minute version. If you want to hear something even better than Highway 61, and almost in June.
A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall.
Oh, well, that's a much tougher one. That's a book, I mean, Hard Rain, you could, I mean, Ginsberg says something really, really clever. It's like if he never wrote another song, writing A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall put him in the pantheon. And I agree with him.
The Times They Are Changing.
It's funny. When Bob, if you remember, a Canadian merchant bank used Times They Are A-Changing as their TV ad song. And people were up in arms. Dylan fans were saying, how could he do this? How could he sell out like this? And I was on a radio show at the time it happened. Somebody asked me about it. I said, well, the day he wrote the song, Tony Glover was up at his apartment and saw the lyrics and read them and turned to Bob and said, what is this shit? And Bob said, it seems to be what people want.
Wow. How about Like a Rolling Stone?
Again, that's a book. That's, I mean, I get into the real detail in the new book about how that song came about. And it's a really tortured story, that what he's reaching for is so elusive. And the process of melting it down into 4 verses. But yeah, you could spend a lifetime working on that.
Rainy Day Women, number 12 and 35.
I prefer the instrumental version. First Night at Warfield, 1992. Walked on, opened with it, didn't sing a word. Wonderful moment.
Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues.
Oh, well, that's, again, I talk about that in the book. Thankfully, one of the things they got in Tulsa is the original TypeScript. And you see the song and what he's trying to do, and it's not there. He hasn't worked it out, but you can see how all the elements are already in place. He just needs to stretch it out. And you realize this is it. This is where he found the code for Highway 61. Like a Rolling Stone is not the code. Like a Rolling Stone is of a piece with itself. It's not of a piece with the album. That's why it comes first. Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues is the key that unlocks Highway 61.
You talked a bit earlier, but Tangled Up in Blue.
Oh, God, and that really is a book. I actually had a friend of mine who was writing in New York. He was writing an entire book based upon the idea of Tangled Up in Blue. And I was like, yeah, there's a book there because it's a lifetime. He said, Bob summed it up beautifully. This is a song it took me 10 years to live and 2 years to write.
Times Have Changed.
Things Have Changed, maybe.
Sorry,
I don't know any song called Times Have Changed.
Sorry, Things Have Changed.
Well, I think we already talked about this, but that line in Things Have Changed may well be the most important line of a Bob Dylan song from the 21st century. I'm trying to, keep as far away from myself as I can.
Most of the Time.
San Jose, 1992, Fifth and Man. Last time we ever played it, I think I'm right in saying the last time we ever played it, and the greatest performance of the song ever.
This is like a
I was
verbal,
about that far from him. It was amazing.
it's like a verbal search engine talking to you, and you turn around and give the best bootleg live version of the song. Best version. Yeah, that's remarkable. It's but what I'm thinking is, can you give me what makes the song, is it important to you? Is it not? Is it, that's more. How about Not Dark Yet?
Well, I mean, the thing about most of the time is that the rhythm is what makes that song, and how he breaks the lines, and I don't pretend. I don't care if I ever see you again. Just the beautiful symmetry of the writing, because that is the song. If you wrote that as a piece of prose, you'd be like, what's clever about that? And then you cut it up, and then you perform it, and you breathe life into it. The reason I mentioned the San Jose, and again, I don't know if the video's online. There is a video of that show, and the sweat on his face and the intensity of the performance. And Dylan, see, when I hear that song, that's what I think of. I think of Dylan 2 yards away, 2 feet away, sweat on his brow, living the song. And, you don't get that very often, that experience of being able to see how much something means to the creator of something.
Moving on, Not Dark Yet.
Not quite there.
Got to Serve Somebody.
Grammy Awards, 27th of February 1980. I love that. I just love that moment. And I love the fact that I talk about this in Trouble in Mind, that it turns out that when they did the rehearsals and everything, they were trying to get Bob to fit into the time frame. Of course, American television, got to have an ad break, got to have a da-da-da. And they're like, it's got to be 4 minutes. It can't be a second over. And Bob, the standard version of Sir Somebody was 4 minutes. So he goes out and plays a 7-minute version. And it's just like, you will not tell me how long my songs can be. And it's brilliant. I mean, he's so into it. And he's like, oh, we've only played for 5 minutes. I better do another harmonica break. And you can just tell the people in the booth are ripping their headphones out. He's never going to work in television again. Oh, shit. He's Bob Dylan. And we amount to nothing.
Awesome. How about this one? Masters of War.
Well, I mean, again, I write about the original idea for the song in the book, which is very interesting, in Dylan staying with Philip Saville and all that. But since we got to keep it brief, Hiroshima, 1994. What an amazing performance. Acoustic, solo. Hasn't played it in a long, long time. And he's in Hiroshima. And he plays Masters of War. It's a chilling moment. Absolutely chilling. And it's an amazing performance.
One of his best songs ever?
One of his most powerful songs. I was given a copy of the manuscript, of what purports to be the manuscript for Masters of War, and the manuscript wasn't very interesting, but there was a drawing at the end of the manuscript. And the guy who gave it to me, certain question marks about some of his stuff. He was a friend of Dylan's. But I looked at the drawing and he says, what do you think? And I said, give me a scan of the drawing, a proper high-res scan. He sends me the scan and I zoom in. And I'm like, have you looked at this drawing? And he goes, what do you mean? I said, the guy who's standing over the grave with the guitar, he's got a cloven hoof. It's like that moment of realizing the layers of thought that go into Dylan's songs. It's not Bob Dylan with a guitar standing over the grave. It's the devil. And, I was like, wow.
Try this one. Knocking on Heaven's Door.
television.
But as a song, as a
As a
Bob,
television song, it's a great song. Yeah.
you don't seem like you like it very much as a Bob Dylan song.
I adore Dylan's version. I think it's an absolute masterpiece, but you know, you can only go so far. And you know, if he'd have let Tom Verlaine play on the original session, it would have been a better song. Yeah. It wouldn't, because Tom was not a great guitarist in 1972. But yeah.
Forever Young.
Yeah. I have seen him do great Forever Young. The same night we were talking about Simple Twist of Fate, Earl's Court, fifth night, 1981. They had major problems with the sound system, and Dylan tried to play the harmonica ending to Forever Young, and there was feedback or something, and Dylan was like, oh, and he stopped, and the band kept playing, and the drummer in that band was Jim Keltner, the greatest living drummer. And Dylan tried again, and they sorted the sound out, and Dylan went for it, and Keltner is behind him. And Dylan's always talked about this relationship he has with drummers. It's very important. And Keltner is just completely locked in on Bob. And just to hear those two playing off each other, him playing harmonica, Keltner on drums, unbelievable moment. And that, again, Forever Young, that's the moment I reach for.
Wow. Simple Twist of Fate.
We've already done Simple Twist of Fate.
Mr. Tambourine Man.
I mean, you know, the thing about Tambourine Man is it's a breakthrough song, but it's a breakthrough song that comes very shortly after Chimes of Freedom. I mean, literally within 2 weeks of Chimes of Freedom. I think Chimes of Freedom is probably the greater breakthrough. I don't mean it's the greatest song. I mean, the shift in his songwriting is presaged by Chimes of Freedom much more than Tambourine Man. But yeah, absolute masterpiece.
And the cover version?
What, the best cover version?
Well, when I think of Dylan, I can't help but think of the Byrds versions, because it seemed like that was the tip of the iceberg, that where Dylan started to emerge into the public consciousness. Maybe I have it wrong, but he was certainly helped along by that. I mean,
yeah. I mean, you always have that problem, you know. I mean, Mr. Tambourine Man went to #1. Subterranean Homesick Blues went to 32. Now, one of them is the future. You know, you really don't have to guess which one. You know, I mean, Tambourine Man, it's an amazing arrangement that butchers the song. By which I mean simply that as a pop song, it's a masterpiece. As an interpretation of Bob Dylan, it is an insult. It is an insult to the meaning of the song. It distorts and twists the meaning of the song to the point of irrelevance and ruins the song devastatingly. It's a great pop song. But, you know, if you're going to butcher stuff like that, pick somebody like the Beach Boys or the Beatles to do it. Please don't do it to a Dylan song. Yeah.
oh. I Shall Be Released.
Oh, well, there you go. I Should Be Released. I don't think there's any version that comes close to the original, the basement tape version. I think that moment and Dylan's harmony with Richard Manuel, I don't think there's anything comes close. All I would say is, please, if you genuinely like that performance, track down the bootleg version, which is in the proper stereo. The version that has been released officially sounds fine, but it's lost so much by panning the stereo in. You need to hear it properly. Bob in one speaker, Richard in the other.
Wow. You've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate what you've done here and taken
Hey, it's fun.
so much time here to go on so many of these little side roads that you've been down many, many times. Thank you for taking me down and taking us down these side roads. Clinton, I am looking forward to not only seeing how well this book does, and hopefully it will, and celebrating Bob Dylan's 80th birthday with yourself and others that appreciate this artist. Looking forward to your second volume of this, and honestly, any other books that you want to write, okay? Because I love them all. I honestly.
Oh, God bless you. I mean, you know, if you track down this one for the money and all the madmen, you obviously have put some dedication in, you know.
Yeah, and we're on the same wavelength here. So it's great to connect with someone like yourself transatlantically during these difficult times during the pandemic and share this. And it's very timely. Congratulations for hitting your deadlines and getting this book out in time.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I would be more than happy to do something else that was unbob related. So as and when the time is right, do let me know. And thank you again. And send my love to Cleveland, one of my all-time favorite cities and one of my all-time favorite music scenes.
We definitely will. Thank you so much for taking time with us. Thanks, Clinton.
Yeah, no problem.
It's Thomas Mulready from Cool Cleveland. Have a great week in Cool Cleveland.